Hi, this is Miss Leone, and I'm going to explain to you what the story arc is. So most stories follow the same basic pattern. We picture it to look like a shape we call an arc. Things start off normally until a problem is introduced, and then the events build up until they reach the most exciting moment, and after that, everything settles back down again. Each of these parts has a name. In the early part of the story, we get some exposition. This is when we learn important background information about the protagonist and their normal way of life. Think of it as exposing the audience to a little bit of backstory. And by the way, the protagonist is the main character in the story. So things are going along normally, but then along comes a conflict, where something happens that creates a problem for the protagonist. Every story has to have some kind of conflict or problem, and this is where that starts. Once the problem has been introduced, we get the rising action, a sequence of events that happen as a result of the conflict. These usually get more intense over time. The climax is the most exciting part of the story, the turning point. This often happens near the end of the story, but not right at the end. And then what comes next is the falling action, the events that happen after the climax. In a lot of stories, the falling action happens pretty quickly because the most exciting part is already over, and the writer doesn't want to bore the reader. Finally, there is a resolution, where the loose ends are tied up, and we see how things have changed as a result of the events that happened in the story. In this story here, it says Jordan had always been afraid of spiders until the day he and his friend Brian were hanging around in the backyard. They saw a spider in the grass, and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. At first Jordan said no, then Brian did it first to show Jordan that it wouldn't hurt him. Still he wasn't convinced. Finally, when Brian said he would let Jordan use his skateboard for a week, Jordan did it, and it turned out it wasn't that bad after all. So, we learned that Jordan had always been afraid of spiders and that he and his best friend Brian were hanging around in the backyard one day. That's the exposition. The background information, the situation before anything really interesting happens. But then something interesting happened. They saw a spider, and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. And now we have a conflict because Jordan is afraid of spiders and he has to decide what to do. Next, we have the rising action. First, Jordan said no. Next, Brian let the spider crawl up his leg to show Jordan that it wasn't so scary. Finally, Brian told Jordan he could borrow his skateboard for a week if Jordan would do it. Finally, Jordan let the spider crawl up his leg. This is the climax, the most exciting part of the story. After that, we get to the falling action. Jordan realized that having a spider crawl on his leg wasn't so scary. The resolution that comes from this is that Jordan is less afraid of spiders after this event. Because the story is very, very short, it doesn't say this directly, but the last line, right here, suggests that he will be less afraid from now on. In some stories, a resolution isn't always stated clearly, but it is implied by the character's thought or actions.